So we are starting, and there's nobody right now in the call who does not know the project and the last summer school. But anyway, I will really shortly just tell who we are, what we are doing, and also give some announcements for the next step after this. And we will come back to the announcements probably in the end of the call, we should remind. So we right now have a seminar. We had, after the last summer school, we had a reading seminar, and now we are continuing. And from now on, we really kind of continue to prepare for the topic of the next school. So the talk that we have today, I'm really, really thankful that, Gerard, that you are kind of able to focus totally on what you heard from us will be the topic on our next school. So it will be collective agency, conditions, and intentions. And we are still kind of asking what is all of this in the context of transformation, and if transformation is a kind of it's not just reflection, but also intervention in some way. So in this sense, transformative research. So there are the dates of the school. Hopefully they stay. We will give you updates on this. And one more thing. Also, if there's anybody, but here everybody has our contact. But if there's anybody who joins the call, and maybe we should show it in the end if somebody joins, because if you want to be part of the school, you can contact us. And we also right now can announce, and we'll end with this as well, that we will have in 1 month already the next seminar similar to this one. So we will have an introductory lecture to hopefully maybe one of the courses during the school by Donatella Di Cesare from Rome, but the topic will still be announced, but you can already remember the date. So the 23rd of March in Kiev in the evening. And I will stop sharing the screen from my side, and I can just shortly introduce Professor Gerard Delanty. You're a Professor Emeritus from Sussex, UK, but you're right now in Spain, right? And if I understood, and if I understood you right, maybe you can correct that there's 3 main topics you're interested in right now. And for me, it was almost a surprise how close all the topics are to what we are thinking about. And one topic was actually societal transformations or social transformations. Another topic I found was how we think today about the future. So also reflecting the way, like not only what we think the future will be, but how we think of it. And the third topic is rethinking European heritage and Europe as something we are kind of living in. And maybe if I forgot something or you would like to focus on something more, then you can add. And otherwise, also the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, for inviting me to talk and for your introduction. Yeah, I'm recently retired Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Social Political Thought at Sussex University. I spent most of my career in the UK. I'm originally from Ireland, and yeah, I spent a long time earlier in Germany. I'm now, as I said, retired. I'm living in Barcelona, more or less now permanently. And yeah, my work at the moment, which will be for the foreseeable future, is what I call ideas and theories of the future. I've recently published a book called Senses of the Future on this topic. And yeah, I'm very interested in your topic on collective action. And it was pretty interesting in preparing this talk to go back to a lot of slightly older literature, especially in the 1990s, a lot of literature on collective action in the 1990s. Yeah, so maybe I should just go into it. My talk is titled Collective Action and Societal Transformation, and it's a conceptual introduction. I'm looking here more on the philosophical literature on collective action. So my aim, which I want to make clear, is to discuss the kind of the conceptual philosophical aspects of collective action, and secondly, to relate it to social transformation. And if there's any sort of linguistic problems, or absolutely feel free to interrupt and ask me to clarify anything. Can you hear and understand me? Can I just, good. Yeah, thank you. So it's really informal, so please do interrupt me. Yes, and I am happy to offer further lectures online on more substantive cases of some more sort of more sociologically oriented studies on historical and contemporary collective action. Now, the basic question that I'm actually addressing is how collective action enables social and political transformation. There's a further question I'm also interested in, and it's whether or not the age of collective action has passed. That is the age when collective action could bring about major societal transformation. Okay, so to begin, I distinguish between collective agency and collective action. I think that's conceptually important. Agency is what makes possible action. The former is a capacity for action. For this reason, for sure, the terms can be used interchangeably, and it would be ridiculous to say, no, you can't use collective agency, you must use collective action. They can be used interchangeably, but I prefer to speak of collective action rather than collective agency, not least because that term is kind of preferred in the literature. But I think actually the distinction is important conceptually, because action cannot occur without agency, while agency might not necessarily result in action. I think that's an interesting question because people often see themselves as having agency, but are not always clear on what action might result from their agency. However, arguably, collective actors by definition have agency and are capable of action, which may be potential, so not yet actualized. There's also the complicated role of collective intentions, which has been explored by analytical philosophers, for example, Gilbert, the famous one. Collective actors are those who engage in collective action. So just a few conceptual points to begin with. Now, a feature of the present day, and of course today, well, I suppose technically yesterday was the fourth anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's a good time to be thinking about collective action and social transformation. But more generally, a feature of the present day is on the one side a highly individualized world, while on the other side we see many examples of collective action. Capitalism and consumer culture promotes individualized action, which is also now the basis of the algorithmic communication of the internet. While on the other side, political movements, I say just political movements here, not necessarily social movements, both of the right and the left are expressions of collective action. The problem, too, is that democracy, at least in the dominant form of liberal democracy, is based on the individual and requires individual, not collective action. I know political parties or maybe reflect a dimension of collective action, but I think that's now been highly formalized and ultimately it's individual action. This is also the case with rights. Rights are predominantly, not necessarily exclusively, but they're predominantly the rights of individual citizens, so not of collective citizens. And on the whole, collective action is forced to the margins of the political, as in acts of protest. Collective action in itself is not a normative concept. It may take highly undesirable forms. They're like radical right-wing forms of collective action, as well as ones that can be associated with progressive values. So my concern here is with democratic collective action as both a normative and also as an empirical concept. And in my view, it's not possible to have an adequate understanding of societal transformation without a notion of democratic collective action. So I'm invoking the notion of collective action as a normative concept that has an ethical grounding, as Karl Otto Appel argued, a great German philosopher who has been a source of great inspiration for me, at least. As such, the notion of collective action entails value judgments. For instance, the claim that democracy, however you understand it, parliamentary liberal democracy, radical democracy, participatory, discursive democracy, and so on, is inherently desirable, and that it provides the broad normative context to understand societal transformation. It can furthermore be related to a notion of human autonomy in relation to domination. To speak of collective action as democratic political action is to place at the center of analysis social struggles, since collective action is invariably bound up with contestation and contention. A key idea for me is that there's never been any, ever in history, I think I would like to say, it's a big claim, I know, there's never been any progressive social change without social struggles. Some of the major achievements of modern society, like the rights of citizenship, for example, from civic, political, social, cultural rights, just for example, are all products of social struggles. These rights were not the gifts of the state. That's one conservative view, but they were won because of social struggle. Conservative accounts of modernity fail to recognize this, as for example in the Sociology of Talcott Parsons or T.H. Marshall, the famous British theorist, in his now famous account of modern citizenship. So these rights to citizenship are not gifts of the state that the state gave to people, but they were rather won against the state in context of social struggle. So I agree here, to a point at least, with Axel Honneth, that social struggles of recognition, itself a normative concept, of course, have been constitutive of modernity, in that the institutionalized forms of recognition, as in rights, emanated from the experience of misrecognition. However, as I see it, a wider notion of political action is required beyond Honneth's theory of recognition to understand the makeup of political community. And the notion of recognition does not, in my view, capture all aspects of social and political struggle. I can return to that later. In what follows, I will consider some of the main philosophical works dealing with collective action. The aim here is to clarify some of the points I've just made regarding the tie between collective action and democracy and societal transformation. So a brief discussion of the most famous work on collective action is in order, and don't despair at the mention of this work, because I think it is important. Mancur Olson's seminal 1965 work, The Logic of Collective Action. Students of radical politics are not very well disposed to this work, because of the philosophy of rational choice that underlies it. But this is actually to the detriment of radical politics, because Olson was not so much defending rational choice as trying to show collective action could in fact overcome its inherent problems, which are problems of rationality, and the fact that individual rationality tends to undermine collective rationality. I emphasize trends because, as I understand this work, it's not an iron law at all. And collective action is not rendered impossible. Many people operating from a rational choice perspective think that's the case. The creation of public goods requires collective action, but precisely because of the success of collective action in creating public goods, you have the free rider situation, which arises when a collective actor becomes so large that it does not need all members to contribute to the public goods produced. The larger the group, the more free riders you have. The free rider problem actually arises because of the success of collective action in advancing the interests of all. But this success declines for sure as the group increases in size and achieves its aims. Collective interests can nonetheless, according to Olson, be sustained through incentives, also through punishment. Now, this book, which is a work of genius, is primarily concerned with cost-benefit dynamics. It's been incredibly influential beyond the fields of economics and political science, where it first arose. It's been debated whether. Sorry, I'm just making a note to myself. Whether Olson's theory applies to social movements. with some saying it was based only on groups organized around economic interests and is not applicable to social movements seeking societal transformation. Now, that's basically the position of one of the most famous theorists of social movements, Sidney Tarrow, like a very major writer on social movements, especially in the 1990s. Now, the question here is, in essence, whether the free rider problem is really the critical issue. So much of the literature is about, collective action being undermined by the free rider. The problem is more social, as Tarrow notes. I just quote Tarrow here. I looked up one of his major publications for preparing this talk. Movements do have an action problem, but it is social, coordinating unorganized, autonomous, and dispersed populations into common and sustained action. They solve this problem by responding to political opportunities through the use of known modular forms of collective action, by mobilizing people within social networks and through shared cultural understandings. So, end of the quote. So it would suffice to note just for now here that the positive dimensions of collective action are not guaranteed. Collective interests do not automatically follow or lead to collective action. And collective action is fraught with irrational effects, such that it is rational for individuals to act against the common good when they support it and even benefit from it. Now, this is also one of the fundamental points of tension between capitalism and democracy. The former, capitalism, does not require much collective action, while the latter, democracy, does, well, depending on the kind of notion of democracy, perhaps. Capitalism does not need democracy, but it seems to be the case, and it's really puzzling and interesting, that democracy does need capitalism. At least all democratic societies have been capitalist. The most successful democracies are those that accommodated in some way capitalism, or reduced the rougher aspects of it, shall we say, as in the notion of democratic capitalism. In essence, forms of democracy that reduce forms of democracy that reduce democracy to political parties and individual voting. So it kind of tempers, domesticates, I should really say, rather than accommodate capitalism. So democracy domesticates capitalism. My point to emphasize is that collective action is difficult and it's prone to irrational outcomes, while individual action is always easier. One of the problems for any kind of collective action, at least once a movement grows, is to solve the free rider problem. However, as I just remarked, perhaps this problem has been given too much place in the literature. I will just note but not discuss the famous and much misunderstood argument associated with Adam Smith that collective interests are best served by the pursuit of collective. Sorry, I will repeat this. The argument associated with Adam Smith that collective interests are best served by the pursuit of individual interests. But this is, of course, not a theory of collective action. It has no place in Adam Smith's work or his legacy. And of course, that's been much misunderstood. In the rational choice literature, which should be seen primarily as an explanatory approach to social inquiry, and not, just an ideological approach, as many left-wing critics think, a particularly interesting proponent is John Elster, a Norwegian, now US political moral philosopher. In his work, which I find fascinating, we find a parsimonious sociological approach to many social problems, especially those that entail trust and collective action. One of the many merits of his work is that he avoids the kind of normative bias that you do find in rational choice approaches. And I don't think Olson was guilty of this, towards valuing individual choice over collective interests and public goods. Now, Elster claims, contrary to mainstream rational choice, that people do not always act on the basis of their rational interests. which reduces the explanatory power of rational choice, since it cannot account for the role of emotions or how people actually interpret their interests, because they might misinterpret their interests. However, he argues that people do desire to be rational. They might not succeed because of their emotions or whatever, or they might just misjudge how to be rational. However, he argues that the aim of sociology is to, nonetheless, to try to understand irrational outcomes of individual decisions in order to build institutions based on trust and cooperation. His work demonstrates that collective action, such as rebellions, are driven as much by emotion as rationality, in the sense of the rational calculation of benefits. Yeah, so a great writer relevant to collective action. Now, in 1980, two German political sociologists, Klaus Offe, who died recently, was one of the really great German political sociologists of the last decades, and Helmut Wiesenthal, published what is really now a classic paper called The Logic of Collective Action in 1980, The Logic of Collective Action. In this lengthy and intricate text, it's an absolutely brilliant text altogether, they develop Olson's theory in a sociological direction to examine the dynamics of social conflict, taking as the main example labor versus capital, the less powerful versus the more powerful. They argue, and I'm quoting here, differences in the position of a group in the class structure. We consider here only the classes of labor and capital, not only lead to differences in power that the organizations can acquire, but also lead to differences in the organizational practices or logics of collective action, by which organizations of capital and labor try to improve their respective positions vis-a-vis each other. These differences tend to be obscured by the interest group paradigm and the underlying notion of a unitary and utilitarian logic of collective action that covers all associations. So what they really say is the less powerful, people who are less powerful have to invest more in collective action than the more powerful do. This means that the less powerful are more prone to problems in advancing their collective interests, a problem that is compounded by the fact that the less powerful will invariably have more than one collective interest to pursue, leading to differences with the collectivity, whereas the less powerful, the capitalists here, generally have less interests to deal with. Collective identity also plays a greater role for the less powerful, but this can serve them well if they manage the necessarily fraught situation. Now, one of the fascinating arguments of this brilliant text, and was really interesting returning to reading it for preparing this talk, is, I quote here, the logic of collective action of the relative powerless differs from that of the relatively powerful in that the former implies a paradox that is absent from the latter, the paradox that interests can only be met to the extent that they are partly redefined. Therefore, the organizations in which the collective action of the relatively powerless takes place must always be, in fact always are, construed in such a way that they simultaneously express and define the interests of the members. So, end of quote. What this suggests is that collective action is inseparably connected with the interpretation of your interests, of your goals, and the group identity that are constantly need to be redefined and reinterpreted. These interpretations are filtered through a web of factors such as emotions, fear, anger, and are often responses to very specific situations. Through such measures, the free rider problem is avoided or significance reduced. So I think, within this really interesting literature, you do find a kind of a problem, a solution to the problem of the free rider, that it's less important. The notion of democratic collective action is more than what might be termed a kind of a banal concept of collective action, often simply aggregate individual actions, or those actions that reflect a degree of rationality that are common. For example, people queuing up in a queue, people queuing up for something. That's a form of collective action, but it's also kind of a rather banal example, isn't it? But in that sense, it's not banal because all of social life is collective at some point. Collective action is possible because of the social nature of human life. So this suggests a deeper notion of collective action than in the political theory literature I was just discussing. Now, I haven't mentioned, largely for reasons of time and also because of my own competence, and a very important work is Elinor Ostrom's really important work, Governing the Commons, that should be considered, but for reasons of time and my own expertise, I'm not an expert on her work, to be frank. Now, I know Hannah Arendt is a source of inspiration for some of you. Maria commented in a description of the workshop rationale on Arendt. So Hannah Arendt's theory of action in the human condition in 1958 is one of the most famous accounts of action as constitutive, not just of political life, but of social life. The Viva Activa, that what she calls the Viva Activa, fundamental. The Viva Activa consists of three dimensions, or three human activities that are fundamental: it's labor, work, and action. Quoting the famous words of the first few pages on page 7. They are fundamental because each corresponds to one of the basic conditions under which life on earth has been given to man. Yeah, man. This somewhat now antiquated expression that people used in the 1950s. Humanity is the correct English word to use today. End of quote. Her conception of action was ontological in that it was constitutive of human life and is unmediated by objects. Now, her position differs, of course, here from Hegel and Marx, who saw action as always mediated. It also corresponds to the condition of human plurality, which he emphasizes, the plurality of humankind, in the sense of what is common to all humans. Furthermore, it is the basis of political life and is given by the fact of natality, the fact of birth. Birth, not death, is what defines the essence of the political. Action creates the condition of the possibility of human societies to have history. In chapter 5, where the substantive outline of the concept of action is provided, Arendt connects it with speech, the ability to communicate. Through speech and action, humans reveal who they are. Just a little quote here. Action and speech are so closely related because the primordial and specifically human act must at the same time contain the answer to the question asked of every newcomer, who are you? End of quote. Now, Arendt's concept of action, while highly political and more than political, is almost a primordial concept relating to the human condition itself. And while it finds its expression in social life, and above all in the shared public domain, it is not exhausted by its expressions. It's important to appreciate that action, in her philosophical framework, is not to be equated with collective action. Much the same can be said of the sociological theory of action, as in the tradition from Max Weber, who made the notion of social action central to his work, or in the sociological tradition of George Herbert Mead, the American sociologist who was basically the founder of the symbolic interaction and tradition, the philological tradition. Now, with regard to this tradition, mention can be made, and I think it really should be made, of the book by Hans Joas, a German social theorist, The Creativity of Action. The Creativity of Action, published in German in 1992, in English in 1996. Now, in The Creativity of Action, Joas, who is in the footsteps of Mead, kind of provides a reinterpretation of Mead's thought. US explores the philosophical pragmatism, American philosophical pragmatism, and its reception by Mead in sociology. So it's a kind of an attempt to develop philosophical pragmatism, the American tradition, associated with Mead and Dewey and others, and the more sociological pragmatism that was reflected in Mead's writings. Now, in this work, The Creativity of Action, US emphasized the creative dimension of action. In this context, it can be noted that that for philosophical pragmatism, so like William James, that is John Dewey, action is the foundation of knowledge. But I think for an adequate theory of collective action, we need to go beyond these intellectual traditions. While the pragmatists and Arendt, in their different ways, provided a far-reaching concept of action as foundational to the human condition and the condition of the possibility of politics, there is little to offer for a radical conception of collective action. As is well known, Arendt had a somewhat pessimistic view of the instrumentalization of action in the modern world, a position I think is probably influenced by her mentor Martin Heidegger, while the pragmatists, in contrast, held to a relatively conservative view and a positive, not a pessimistic view, but of the modern state. They were conservative, liberal American thinkers. The spectre of societal transformation was not within their sights. It is true that the pragmatists did consider social transformation. However, in this tradition, societal transformation was historical. It already happened. It already occurred with the transition to modernity and with the consolidation of modern American society and the coming of what was called in those days the Great Society, the vision of US President Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1960s. So for this tradition, there could only be amelioration, not transformation anymore. Before moving on, a further qualification to what I just said is in order. Hans Joas, in his reconstruction of both philosophical and sociological pragmatism in that book, The Creativity of Action, that I did refresh my memory with preparing for this talk, he did in fact try to develop a theory of collective action that could be related to radical politics and the new social movements of the 1980s into the 1990s. May I just quote him here directly? By focusing on collective action rather than purely individual action, it becomes much easier to proceed to issues such as the emergence, reproduction, and the transformation of social order. This is true in the twofold sense that not only do collective forms of social action and social movements contribute significantly to developing and changing social order, but they can also be understood in themselves as models of social order in the process of self-generation. By the way, I can send, with the notes of this talk, the references, so you don't need to be trying to look for them or write them down. Now, in a work more attuned to the changing political climate of the 1960s and 1970s, with the rise of new social movements, Jürgen Habermas, in the theory of communicative action, that was published in German in 1981. In English, volume 1 was in 84 and volume 2 in 86, provided the foundation for a new conception of action that captured, on the one side, its ontological nature, as constitutive of social life and human life itself, and on the other side, its politically transformative nature. And just excuse me while I turn on the light. It suddenly got dark in here. So he kind of solved the problems in Arendt, and he also solved problems in other approaches by being able to combine these two perspectives by means of the notion of communicative action. He sought to reconstruct the history of sociological theory to create a new framework based on the centrality of communicative action. By combining the sociology, the sociological theory of action, in the tradition of Weber and Mead, different, of course, as these were, with a theory of communication defined by an orientation towards reason, coming more from Kant, also Hegel. Habermas was able to build into the new theory a normative basis for critique. Communication entails dynamics that capture what has traditionally been understood as reason, that is, the capacity to make sense of the world through critique and reflection. The key idea of communication oriented towards reaching an understanding, as he called it, through deliberation remained the defining tenet of Habermas's work, which was preoccupied with the problem of emancipatory potentials, what he called emancipatory potentials, which can be understood as emancipation from domination, but more specifically, the identification of capacities for societal advancement. Learning is essential to his theory, both on the level of individual learning, but also on the level of collective learning. Societies move forward in history through expanding the scope of communicative solutions to problems. Social movements are the critical collective agents in his theory, especially those that move society forward rather than collective struggles concerning just only resistance and withdrawal. So a big emphasis on societal movements that move society forward rather than simply those that are concerned more with only with resistance and withdrawal. Habermas's social theory is much in common with Arendt, especially regarding the theory of action, speech as communication, and a strong notion of collective action as a form of power that challenges domination. However, he breaks from her somewhat idealized conception of action that set it contrary to modernity and a conception of the shared domain of the public sphere as a sphere free of domination. Unlike Arendt, Habermas's project sought to redeem the potentials within modern society, which, on the whole, depending on how you read Arendt, I know there's some differences perhaps here, are intended to see modern society in terms of some kind of model of decline. The notion of collective learning is one of the most important aspects of Habermas's critical theory of society, and it's been developed by sociologists such as Claus. As is well known, Habermas's theory culminated in a theory of modern society caught in the throes of a conflict between system and life world, roughly corresponding to the conflict between communicative reason and instrumental rationality. Also, a little bit parallel to the distinction between democracy and capitalism. Collective action, as reflected in social movements, defend the life world against the colonizing forces of the system, like capitalism, bureaucratization, for example. As he said, quote, the new conflicts arise along the seams between system and life world. Now, it's a grandiose theory. It's been much discredited for many reasons, at least due to its somewhat dualistic conception of modernity in terms of this, conflict between system and life world, between instrumental rationality and the resistance from communicative rationality. Despite the criticisms, which I won't discuss here for reasons of time, I will just take us in a different direction. The flaws, of course, of the theory are there. One major outcome that I think is still valid is that it draws attention to major societal transformation deriving from collective action struggles. Despite the unstoppable expansion in instrumental rationality, in modern society, with the expansion of capitalism and so on. However, defined in terms of capitalism, bureaucratization, and how you like societal complexity, the Habermasian perspective insists on the importance of a normative critique grounded in the capacity that people have for reason, the capacity for critical reflection, for autonomy, and self-problematization. Domination is never so total that it obliterates the capacity for protest. Oppressive forms of power always meet the resistance of other forms of power, such as the power of communication. We can note in passing that some theorists a famous example is perhaps the French theorist Jean Baudelaire held a different view about the experience of protest, and Herbert Marcuse, from a different position, believed that the arrival of one-dimensional society, his famous book of 1964, obliterated protest. Let's just park that critique at the moment, to just assume it's not valid. It seems the record of human history bears out the Habermasian perspective, in my view, perhaps because I'm biased in favor of Habermas here, although I've become more critical of him recently for other reasons, which I won't go into. One of the features of human existence since the earliest of times is the evolution of cooperation, which is as constitutive of human life as its conflict and egoism. The fact of cooperation as integral to the human condition and social life creates the conditions for collective action and the formation of social movements. Now, I accept that the second premise, the formation of social movements, what I just said there, doesn't necessarily follow from the first, the fact of cooperation as a feature of the human condition. So I accept that that doesn't necessarily lead to the capacity for collective action, understood as having the potential for societal transformation. But for much of human history, at least what we can term in the modern period, this really was the case. In the following in the following lecture, which I'm happy to give if there's an interest in it, I could consider more specifically social movements as agents of collective action. But now in the present context, I just want to stress the importance of social movements as the main vectors of collective action. However, social movements and collective action are not identical. The latter is not reducible to the former. Collective action, following both Arendt and Habermas in their different ways, is prior to political community, even if it is constitutive of it. So it's prior to political community. And I refer to a book by Ari Motta and Peter Wagner, collective action and social political transformation, very relevant to this topic, where they distinguish, they disagree with the view of social movements as the main form of collective action directing politics in the contemporary world. A key insight in that book, I'm quoting here, is collective action is based on a temporary redefinition of a common ground in which a political self-understanding is constructed and moved forward. A different but related idea is in the writings of Alain Touraine, one of the great French sociologists who died a couple of years ago. His sociology of action, he advanced a sociology of action, which was informed by a particular conception of social movements as agents of what he called historicity, a theory that was outlined most famously in a book in French in 1973, in English in 1977, The Self-Production of Society. So his idea is this: society is made through its self-production by social actors organized as collective agents. Society is the product of conflict and struggle, rather than the reproduction of established structures and institutions. So his sociology is a contrast to, for example, that of Pierre Bourdieu in French sociology. But a social movement is more than a political movement and more than a plurality of movements. It is the movement of society itself, the movement of society on itself. Touraine's social theory of modernity, as in the later critique of modernity, there is essentially one movement, a concept he also relates to the subject. In essence, the capacity for social actors to constitute themselves as agents of social change. One of his important ideas was that the success of a social movement, as opposed to a political movement, can be seen in terms of three principles. It must have a sense of an opposition, an opponent, an identity, and totality. By totality, that's perhaps not clear, he meant it must have awareness of its own historicity, of its own capacity to make history. So not just, achieving a goal, but of making history. It can be understood to be a vision of a society as a whole having a future, in a sense of a capacity to make history. In a similar vein, Ron Ehrman and Andrew Jameson, two Swedish sociologists, in a really influential work on social movements for cognitive approach in 1991, showed how social movements produce new cognitive maps. They called it cognitive maps. Their conception of collective action is what they call cognitive praxis. Social movements produce new kinds of knowledge, eventually going beyond the social movement itself. And that these new forms of knowledge make possible a new kind of society. At work here is something like the production of social imaginaries. Although, if I recall correctly, that's a term they don't use. But maybe that's the moment to refer to another key thinker, Cornelius Castoriadis, in his classic work, The Imaginary Institution of Society, published at least in English in 1987. I've forgotten when the French book was published. I must check that. Anyway, the work that everyone refers to is the English translation with Polity Press, The Imaginary Institution of Society. For Castoriadis, there is what he calls the instituting society and the instituted society. The instituting society is related to the radical imaginary, what he called the radical imaginary, which strives for newness and is the expression of creativity and autonomy. Now, it does not come out of nothing, the radical imaginary, but it derives from the existing society, which it seeks to transform. So there are, in fact, two imaginaries at work, the imaginaries that are directly products of the present, the instituted society, which Castoriadis calls imaginary significations. That's his term, imaginary significations, and the radical imaginaries that seek to go beyond the present. Now, while these are in some way products of the present due to their radical reflexivity, he calls it the radical reflexivity, they are not of the present, but transcend the present. They reach out into the future. While for him there is just one radical imaginary, but arguably, in my view, there are many, and they may conflict too with each other, as the capitalist imaginary and the democratic imaginary, for example. It's not very clear whether in his work the capitalist imaginary is more on the level of imaginary significations and that the democratic imaginary corresponds to the radical, because he doesn't give examples of anything, which is really a problem, except the few examples he gives relate to a highly idealized account of ancient Greece when everything supposedly emerged that was important. But there are no examples in modern society in his work, so it's actually quite difficult pinning his work down empirically. In any case, the important point is that the radical imaginary derives from the transformative agency of collective action by challenging the instituted society. Creativity and autonomy is a key idea in his work, are core features of transformative collective action with autonomy as a form of self-instituting creativity. So that's an absolutely really important work in radical conceptions of collective action. In another tradition, but also part of neo-Marxism, and Castoriadis was, of course, a key figure in neo-Marxism, which he tried to reinvent by drawing on the ideas of Freud, but in a very specific way. There's, of course, Antonio Gramsci's theory of collective action outlined in prison notebooks written when he was imprisoned from 1929 to 1935. The book was published originally in 1949. So collective action here is the struggle to create a counter-hegemonic project. Since domination is exercised through both coercion and consent, it needs to be challenged by new modes of thought. Cultural and intellectual struggle, he emphasizes strongly intellectual struggle, is a major part of collective action struggles. Popular or mass mobilization by subaltern groups must not accept the dominant hegemonic modes of thought, but needs to subvert them in the construction of a counter-hegemonic project. So the Gramscian conception of collective action is therefore to be understood in terms of counter-hegemonic action. So a further question, but not for now, is whether that's really relevant to the present day. Because I have some doubts that there are, in the Gramscian understanding, actually really hegemony. I think in Russia, yes, there's a hegemony there, but in Western societies, is there really? Even in Trump's America, I don't think there's a hegemony. I don't think MAGA in the US is a hegemonic project, because for in Gramsci's terms, at least, for a hegemonic project to be the case, there must be almost no conflict. There must be no contestation. It's the elimination of contestation. Okay, I'll just put that idea there as pocket. Now, mention should also be made here. I'm just trying to identify the conceptual approaches, rather than discuss how they might be empirically related to either historical or contemporary struggles. Mention should also be made of some perspectives in recent political philosophy. So let me just mention here the late Emeritus Marion Young as just one important political philosopher on tackling injustice through collective political action. This generally involves, in our view, the exercise of pressure on powerful social actors and institutions who are in positions of influence or somehow in positions of control, but to whom responsibility can be attributed. Now, what she calls a social connection model of responsibility seeks to connect, make a link between responsibility and injustice. So the aim of collective action here, in her approach, is to target those with responsibility. However, as she herself seemed to recognize, most forms of injustice are produced, in fact, in complex structural situations with structural forces at work, and are not always easily pinpointed, to specific causal forces that can be attributed to, responsibility or people responsible. This makes the task of overcoming injustice all the more difficult. Referring here to an article by someone called Endo, who's discussed this problem in her work. So he points out in quite an insightful discussion, while she appears to assume the necessity of collective action as the exercise of pressure on key social actors of responsibility for the existence of these problems, it mightn't be enough. He notes that the first step for transformative political action involves critically reflecting on our social positions and acknowledging that one participates along with many other people in social processes that produce unjust outcomes. So the problem here is a very great one for democratic collective action, since the attribution of responsibility is often very difficult, making it extremely challenging for collective action to devise effective strategies beyond the general raising of consciousness. But I leave it as an open question for now, whether collective action, I'm just making note to myself, is primarily focused on targeting those with responsibility, or whether this just is narrowing too much the scope of really transformative politics. Now, this also raises another question: collective action as resistance. Most of the accounts, I think, well, all of the accounts I just looked at, I'm not quite sure maybe whether Gramsci fits into this or not, but I think he does, concern major social transformation, where the object of transformation is society itself, not this or this. Like in the US today, like the challenge is to get rid of of Trump, and for the Democrats to be in charge. Basically, that's absolutely necessary, but that's not exactly going to be major social transformation. It might be just simply preventing the worst. But these accounts I just talked about are concerned all with major social transformation. Now, from a very different perspective, with more focus on resistance and the political theory of Michel Foucault, this was precisely not what collective action should be about. Although he did not use the term collective action as such, the notion of resistance that was at the core of his work effectively amounts to collective action. However, it was aimed not at society, as a whole, but at specific what he called technologies of power. But the Foucaultian notion of resistance was all about localized and highly targeted forms of resistance. For example, what he himself was involved in, prisoners in prison, challenging their incarceration. But so, solving that problem of the unjust circumstances in prisons and all of that, of course, incredibly important, isn't going to transform society as a whole. The basic premise of Foucault's notion of resistance was summed up in a much cited passage in the history of sexuality in volume 1, an incredibly famous text. And let me just quote some of the famous words here. I just read it because they have been a source of inspiration for so many people. But I think, I'll just read the words. Where there is power, there is resistance. And yet, or rather consequently, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power. Should it be said that one is always inside power, that there is no escaping it? There is also no absolute outside where it is concerned, because one is subject to the law in any case, or that history being the ruse of reason, power is the ruse of history, always emerging the winner, ? This would be to misunderstand the strictly relational character of power relationships. Their existence depends on a multiplicity of points of resistance. These play the role of adversary, target, support, or handle in power relations. These points of resistance are present everywhere in the power network. Hence, there is no single locus of great refusal, no soul of revolt, source of all rebellions, or pure law of the revolutionary. Instead, there's a plurality of resistances, each of them a special case, resistances that are possible, necessary, improbable, others that are spontaneous, savage, solitary, concerted, rampant, or violent, still others that are quick to compromise, interested, or sacrificial. By definition, they can only exist in the strategic field of power relations. A fascinating text, famous words. On page 95 of the History of Sexuality, and originally sometime in the early 1980s, a source of inspiration now for almost 50 years. It's clear, I think, almost poetic words, I think. It's clear that, I think, in reading this, that the notion of collective action at work here is very limited. Which is not to say it's not important, and not aimed at major social transformation. The great refusal that he refers to here is presumably Marcuse's idea of the untapped capacity for the student movement to become the heir of the working class as the main revolutionary force in the affluent societies of the West. Yeah, so I'm reaching just a conclusion. Oh my God, have I gone on too long? I've discussed here in broad moves a number of quite different philosophical positions on collective action and what kind of philosophical ideas. Most of these are compatible, some are not, with each other. They all derive from very different intellectual traditions, and they're difficult to extrapolate from those contexts. So in conclusion, some takeaways. Collective action is irreducible to individual action. One needs to distinguish between collective agency, collective action, collective intention, and collective identity. I don't want to be too pedantic there, but I think they're useful distinctions to make. One needs to distinguish, sorry, okay, I'll let that. Collective action is the basis of social movements, but it's not reducible to social movements. It's a kind of a resource there that can go in different directions. Collective action does not take just one form, has different logics depending on who the agents are and what their intentions are. As a general rule, those with less power have to invest more in collective action than those with more power. An idea that I've got from the Claus Offe text, the Wiesenthal text that I mentioned. Collective action undertaken by intermediators, representatives, will take a different form from that emanating from subaltern groups. So if I engage on behalf of others, it would be different than those themselves who are affected by power. A major challenge is to sustain collective action beyond critical thresholds. Collective action is subject to always subject to a reinterpretation of identity and goals. And collective action produces societal transformation by producing new knowledge, new models, and social imaginaries of self-interpretation for society as a whole. Progressive change throughout history has always resulted from collective action. So I'll conclude with that. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Affected by power, but the other way.
You've lost your power. Have the Russians hit? Sorry, hopefully not.
And I would, if you have a little bit more time, I would open the possibility up for questions.
Of course, yeah. I'm just trying to raise the volume. I don't know, is my volume down or maybe it's...
Yes, Max.
Yeah, can you hear me well?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect. Because I also found Marie's volume to be very, very low. Perhaps it's a problem at your end, Marie. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for this. Was incredibly instructive. I'm very impressed by how you managed to put the entire sociological theory of the 20th century basically in one lecture. That was an amazing walk through all of the conceptual problems, just as you said. And I have obviously many questions regarding the details, but for that I would need to have a script, the textual version, which if you could send that, I would be very obliged.
Yes, I will look over it tomorrow. I wrote down a lot of what I said, and I have all the references. I'm quite interested in what I've been asked to do. So I will send this to you.
Thank you. But to avoid getting stuck in any of the details of any of the thinkers you mentioned, although you summarized them so coherently, I would like to ask a question that hopefully goes to the heart of the matter. Because when we met in Uzhgorod, we also debated the role of Adam Smith. At least I debated it. I don't know whether that was of interest to any of the others. And here you started with your premise right at the beginning to say that, well, we have this view collection in rational choice theory that it could be just aggregated interests, but basically and that the state and that much of the civilatory I don't know, rights and freedoms and privileges that we enjoy were given by the state, but we refuse that, and we remain convinced that social action and together with social agency and social struggles produce what is required for a well-working democracy. Now I agree with that. But I'm wondering what you would say in detail to the political economist, to the liberal political economist, who says, no, in principle, I'm completely with Adam Ferguson, and I agree that social transformation or societal transformation is a product of, let's say, collective individual action and no collective design. So why do you think that social struggles are so foundational or pivotal in bringing about you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. There can only be a short answer to that, and my focus here is on um, outcomes of collective action, what social action, and I wouldn't want to go so far as to say that the whole structure of modern society is the outcome of collective actions. That would be
Okay.
wrong. So I think one has to just distinguish the kind of not very basic sociological concepts here of structure and agency. So
Yeah.
capitalism, just to refer to capitalism in general, creates the structures of modern society. Um, so I'm definitely not saying that collective action explains everything. So I'm only,
Okay.
I hope that is clear. So it would be, in my view, ridiculous to say that everything is the product of collective intentions or collective action. That would just make no sense. So I wouldn't have a dispute with the followers of Adam Smith, taking into account that there's different positions there. Adam Smith, who wasn't really the high priest of capitalism at all, because he's actually writing in basically almost a pre-capitalist society, and
Yeah.
has been really badly misunderstood and all of that. So let's not go into that. So my only disagreement with those people would be where they dismiss collective action.
Right. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Of course.
Marie has to decide, but I think she's nodding. Okay, perfect. Because again, I completely agree with you. But for example, to go to the case of queuing, right? Like kind of when people queue, we would say that there's social behavior and that is indeed a collective action, but it's not the outcome of any, say, social struggle, right? Like we don't kind of
Yeah.
yeah. So where would you say does the social struggle start? And for what kind of specific, say the Maidan, right? Like the social movement of the Maidan protest in Ukraine. That would be definitely more than simply people waiting in line and queuing to get onto the square. So where does the social struggle begin for you, and why social struggle?
Sure. Of course, I have to clarify that. I hope there's no misunderstanding there. What I said, unfortunately, all too briefly, was that social movements, uh, that social movements as collective actors uh, um, are possible because of the fact of social life.
Right.
But of course, I wouldn't say that social life, that people have a natural tendency to be social and, to queue up as opposed to everyone grabbing something or whatever. That of course doesn't produce social movements. It's you could take other examples like in Habermas' theory, the fact and in Arendt, the fact that human beings are characterized by speech, by communication. So I'm saying the conditions, the possibility of collective action come from the nature of social life, but that doesn't produce social movements. So if I were to talk, I'm going to have to give a separate lecture on it. But if you go into theory, the more kind of political sociology literature, I refer to Sidney Tarrow as Charles Tilley and other famous ones, especially in the 1990s. There's this incredible literature in the 1990s. So collective actors arise because of, for example, political opportunities um, from grievances. But as Tara also pointed out, the fact that people have grievances doesn't necessarily, so you have to look at the dynamics that give rise. So they certainly don't just emerge because of people being social. So that's a whole much more complex question that would have to be separately looked at.
Yeah.
I'm simply emphasizing that collective action does arise from the social nature of action.
Yeah. Which means, in turn, if we want to spin this thought further, that the phenomena we might be interested in from a more Ukrainian or Central European point of view that's interested in social transformation, societal transformation from, for example, post-Sovietic societies to other forms or from war to peace and so on, in fact require I require from us to focus less on the nature of human sociability itself and collective action, and more on the specific conditions that have to pertain for social movements to obtain that have to work.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's why it can be good to look at the social movement literature. Absolutely.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is
Welcome.
absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
So more, I don't know.
And
It's like Maria's notebook
yeah,
cottages.
so you can't see me anymore, but I think you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because if there are right now no other questions I would ask, but I'm in trouble to formulate, but it somehow goes in a similar direction because I was also, it's a little bit this question of what is first, egg or chicken. And I understand that the work that sociologists, the tradition that you showed, the different conceptualization that you showed, is like drawing different separations which allow you to play this game, which is first, because like if you, for example, say system against small resistant or social action against forming of conditions, one can in this different through this there's some way of applied through these different borders play this game what is first. But actually my question was also in the direction of where does social conflict starts, because when the social transformation that we are experiencing right now really heavily is caused also through digitalization, and through this a change or disintegration of functionalities. So kind of functionalities that were integrated into each other get totally disintegrated, and from this a lot of conflicts arise. So probably this is totally in the direction of Max's question, but just to ask what you think of this.
Well, I don't think it's so much a next situation that can be used to characterize some aspects of the situation, of course, but just drawing with reference to the philosophical literature that I've been dealing with here, which is the most useful thing I can do, is to say, depending on which kind of literature you look at, what gives rise to a social movement, what gives rise to a transformational project. If you follow, say, the work of Honneth, it's because of the fact of misrecognition. So there must be a source. Social movements arise, protest, opposition, because of injustices, or if you want to take that perspective, because of injustice, because of misrecognition, or conflicting interests. Or it could be seen in terms of Foucault's notion of where there's power, there is resistance. There's the exercise of, I think we should really say here, in my view, domination, where the fact of domination gives rise to an attempt to overcome it. So I think that's a fact of the human condition. And then, well, I think we're then in the domain of different sociological theories. Are we looking at how the existing society provides the sources? So Honneth's theory is ultimately highly problematical, as many critics have pointed out. I presume you're familiar with Honneth's struggle of recognition work, and the credible data about it. Well, he kind of assumes that the existing society, basically the existing national state, provides the resources. The constitutional democratic state provides the resources, the conditions of the possibility for social struggles to take place. Or an example in parliamentary democracies, that people have the right to protest, for example. So there you have kind of a structure, or from the Habermasian perspective, the shared public domain of the public sphere of the political communication is the source. The fact that contestation is possible, so without discursive contestation, deliberation, that's maybe the starting point. Or you could take the Foucauldian point of view, where there's almost total power. So the situation in a prison as an institution of total power, where the prisoners have no power, basically, or almost no agency. So how do they gain agency as a form of resistance? So,
but it's some way it's always, or maybe just to it's some way it's always a divide, somehow conceptualization that draws a divide between status quo and change.
I would tend to be of that view, and I think one of the perspectives that's come across from several decades now of social movement research is that the success of a social movement, like enormous generalization, is ultimately due to its capacity to build an identity, not just an identity for the movement, but a kind of a worldview. Something that is transformational, like for example, feminism, the women's movement in the 1970s, or depending on where you want to put it, these are the two examples that Habermas took at the end of the theory of connection: the environmental movement and the women's movement. That these were two movements that produced a kind of a collective identity that was transformational, but not just for the movement, but for the wider society. As now today with climate change, that environmental movements are not just environmental movements; they're movements about the nature of society. So I would say that would be an absolutely key capacity, or the point I made regarding to Alan Turing, these three dimensions of an opposition, and a sense of identity and a sense of making history. But right-wing movements can do that. The Trump's movement in the US kind of almost succeeded in fulfilling those three conditions: a strong sense of opposition, who was against a strong collective identity, and a vision of changing American society. And that's what a social movement ultimately needs to do. I think Turing really got it right with that definition, which he worked out in a great book, The Voice in the Eye.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, I see Julia's hand. Maybe she hasn't got the question yet, so I will. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the lecture. Like, what is going in my mind? It's actually, it was like yesterday I was reading a bit Hannah Arendt, and I was reflecting on her relationship with the past, because for her action is like something new. So like it always, there is a sense of this novelty. And I was thinking like probably, so like it seems like she doesn't want to, like by her definition of action, she doesn't want to continue the past because probably of her own conditions of the past, that was Holocaust and all this stuff. And right now, listening you, when you are talking about the collective action as a prerequisite, like for mostly like social movements, and like all your examples is actually, and usually like social, like activists movements, they are against something. They are against, they are opposition into something. And I think like speaking about Ukraine and thinking about Ukraine, that Ukrainians do know how to I don't know, create this collective action, being against against Russia and against like violence and against something. But I'm also thinking, and I want to imagine that collective action can be a creative force, like no, and that we can imagine the new future, and I don't know, like to have the process of meaning making, for example, for Ukraine or the future of Ukraine, not at a point as against something, as opposition, but as something new. So, like, what's your thoughts and reflection?
I think Ukraine is a particularly interesting example because it seems to be um, more of an example of a social movement that took shape in Ukraine from around about 2013 or 14, that period, when Russia went in a totally different direction. You can argue when that departing ways occurred, probably around about 2010, when Russia went in a very authoritarian direction, and Ukraine in a slightly different direction. And so there's the reshaping of Ukrainian society. I think that is a social movement that seems to have all the characteristics of a social movement, as opposed to being a political movement, to make that distinction, where a political movement is something more specific, trying to achieve something rather specific, perhaps maybe once. The environmental movement was a kind of a political movement because it was trying to achieve, certain political objectives. Perhaps a nationalist movement, or again, we can argue, but a political movement normally has a more specific goal than a social movement in the terms of the literature that I've been referring to here, that's more about societal transformation. Yeah, so what's going on in Ukraine? I've been in Ukraine after the war started, actually. I was invited to go to Lviv. It's quite interesting. I got a little bit of an insight into what's going on in Ukraine. It was about 6 months after the war started. It was October that year. And anyway, it does seem to me, from everything I've read about Ukraine and the history of Ukraine, that there was a reorientation took place, a reinterpretation of its own history. Something like that has gone on. I also referred to The Gates of Europe, the author, the professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard. I guess you know who I mean.
Plokhy, Sergei Plokhy.
Exactly. Yeah, reading his works in English as an example, and that literature. I've edited a special issue of the European Journal of Social Theory. I'm the editor of that journal, but I edited a special issue on the moral and political case for the support of Ukraine, with many contributors, including Ukrainian ones, also Ukrainian historians. And so that would be my impression, that what's going on in Ukraine is the formation of a social movement, and it's not just defending against an invasion, because the stakes are very high. For it's not just a political system, but a totally different kind of society than the society that exists in Russia, that somehow seems to accept extraordinary circumstances that almost defy rational understanding. Yeah, so I would see that as corresponding to everything that some of these authors have mentioned, like especially Touraine, a counter-hegemonic project, a social movement in the sense of a movement aimed at societal transformation. Also, like the whole Europeanization of Ukrainian society. Yeah. And of course, too, for Europe, if hopefully Ukraine will meet the criteria to become a European Union member, then that will also be a transformation for Europe in a positive direction.
And also, like the follow-up question, like the same question regarding Europe, do you see the I don't know, this collective like inspired by collective action, the changes and the creation of new social movements in Europe? Because like the war, that like the ongoing war is not only about Ukrainian and Russian relationship, but like it's broader. So yeah, like what's your reflection on on Europe?
Well, what I'm thinking about at the moment, I'm trying to write something. I'm trying to get my thoughts together about the significance of the war between Ukraine and Russia for Europe, because that also relates to the kind of societal transformation, because European countries are slightly waking up today to the fact that things have changed and that there's probably going to be a permanent war against Russia and Europe. And it depends. I'm not an expert on war and defense, but there's different views whether Europe can defend itself without the US against Russia. There's already a hybrid war between Russia and Europe. And that's going to continue. And the big question is, can the European democracies defend themselves? And up to now, the idea was the European democracies, since the Second World War, didn't need to defend themselves because there was NATO, which is basically the United States Army, to defend themselves. So the kind of Cold War idea that we don't need to defend ourselves because Russia seemed not to be a danger. But that all changed with the first invasion of Ukraine, when Russia invaded and occupied the Crimea. And that should have been a signal. But it's clear that Russia is preparing for permanent war. And that if the present conflict ends, it would probably end up with a frozen conflict. But the war will continue. So it's like an absolutely major question for European countries. Like some countries, I'm from Ireland, which considers itself to be military neutral. It's a totally mad idea. There are about 4 countries that are neutral, and other countries that have inadequate armies. Like Sweden has no effective armed forces. Finland does. It's the most military effective country. France has nuclear weapons, but they're useless. The UK has a lot of very nuclear weapons, but there's the question of how can Europe defend itself? People are thinking about this now as a problem for the first time. And, what does defense mean? Does it mean raising an army? Like I live in Spain, in Barcelona. Does that mean that Spanish soldiers would be sent to the front in Eastern Europe? No one wants that. So what does it mean? Also in the age of drone warfare. So there are major questions, but they're not just questions about defense. There are also questions that go to the core of democracies, like the question, does democracy do democracies need to be defended? I think they do. And questions about peace. If you're a pacifist, where do you stand on defense? And how war, like up until recently, I was totally opposed to military spending and opposed to armies, because I thought, like, who's going to invade a European country? Who's going to engage in military action against France and Germany? The Soviet Union, Russia is not going to. But then things changed, and we're living in a very turbulent world with nuclear proliferation. Many countries now have nuclear weapons. Israel, which is a very dangerous country, has nuclear weapons. They say they haven't, but everyone knows they have. China has North Korea and Russia. So it's a dangerous world, and my argument is that European democracies need to see that they need to be able to defend themselves. But that's not just a military question of how you defend yourself, by what means, especially the transformation, the technological transformation of war. But it also goes to the core of the political, and so it's a transformational moment for Europe, and that's why the Russian-Ukrainian war is a wider war, and a lot will depend on what's going to happen in the United States. And Trump will hopefully be severely hit back in the midterm elections in November. Maybe the Democrats will come back. That's not a very exciting prospect, but it's the best hope we have at the moment to save us from the horrific situation that we have with Trump and the breakdown in relations with Europe that are, where we have a situation where Trump is planning a United States invasion of European country, of Greenland. If that happens, and it could happen, I suspect they won't do it because it would be a move too far. But the fact that it's even a possibility means the end of NATO, the end of European defense. Yeah, so they're because the core of the political in Europe. Very interesting how we think about these things.
Because for me, it is the political dimension, that dimension of defense, but it also the question of social imaginary. Because like people in Europe, especially here, like I do live right now in Sweden, and Sweden is the I would say the most peaceful country in the world. And like in Europe, I think like people were growing up for like 70, 80 years with the imaginaries that the war is not possible anymore. So that's why, I mean, it's somehow, and it's super uncomfortable, like to imagine in 24th century that
Yeah.
It's possible. So like it's interesting
Yes.
question how this
Yeah.
like collective social imaginary also work in this case.
Yeah, it's also been shaken by the situation in Israel and the incredible the genocide by the state of Israel in Gaza. I've been writing little bits some articles on that. So that's nothing, just quite literally on the margins of Europe. And the thing about Israel is that it's formally it's formally a liberal democracy. And that's a unique situation where a formal liberal democracy is engaged in acts of war. There's an old saying that democracies don't go to war against democracies. So there's a slightly complicated situation there with Israel, of course, attacking Gaza, which is not organized as a democracy, but has committed genocide. Of course, democracies have committed genocide, like the United States, many examples in Vietnam and other places. But this is on the margins of Europe, and as I've pointed out, not the only one to do so, Israel has a strong relationship with the European Union, and that's a highly problematical situation now. So there's also that quite literally on the margins of Europe, where war has kind of just returned, and the whole legacy of the Second World War that shaped, the last decades is over for Europe. And that's all complicated then with the changing relationship with the United States and the uncertainty around that. So very, very interesting times for people working in social and political theory, because the questions are not just empirical questions. How long can Russia go on? I follow these debates and different commentators have different answers to these questions. They're not ultimately easily answered, but it's clear this war is going to continue, hopefully with a frozen conflict, but Russia won't be satisfied. And absolutely critical is a massive show of resistance from European countries. but it's also then, NATO, like a key NATO country is Turkey. So we're in new times where the defense of democracy is absolutely critical, and it's not something that can be regarded as unimportant.
Okay, shall we do one last question? Okay, Max.
Yeah, I have a last thematic complex, so to say, that I can open, but I can also make it a last question, Marie, if you want to wrap it up. And that concerns the question of what, if anything, could be transformative outside social movements. And I'm thinking here a little bit, I don't know whether you're acquainted with Lubomir Dunay, but perhaps with François Julien, who wrote this book, Les Transformations Silencieuses, the silent transformations, quite popular in France. And a little bit in Central Europe as well. At least I know one scholar who's working with the concept to explain how societies that were shaped by central planning have moved to kind of more capitalistic ways of organizing property and civil society, and that this has precisely not happened in the form of events, political movements, but that it has happened through a change of routines, gradual, incremental change in lifestyle, generations as well that play a very important role, change of technologies, media, and so on. And I wonder, and I'm very interested in contrasting Hannah Arendt with that, so as to say that, well, the political and the social movements might be important, but actually, if we lose sight of the side of daily life and routines, and especially individual knowledge and collective knowledge that is here concerned, we will not get anywhere either, because we will have a highly politicized society, perhaps hyperpolitics, without actually any concrete political implications or results. I wonder just what you think of that.
Yeah, I think the short answer that I would give is that the absolutely key the key thing is the existence of, to follow Habermas here, of an advanced public sphere
Okay.
in like, for example, countries that didn't lose the public sphere, or where it maybe never really existed, but countries that always had a longer tradition of the public sphere, like even Germany after the Second World War, was able to revive. I'm thinking here of the writings of Adorno on this point of how the public sphere of discourse can be revived. I think that's one big difference between Central Europe and some of the more Eastern European countries. That tradition was less developed, and I think, just to take a very simple example, that you can't have radical politics if you don't have an intelligent press. And I think, of course, it's all changed now with the internet, but the existence of newspapers, of critical spaces of discourse in a society, the public sphere in Habermas' sense, also to in Arendt's notion of the public realm. I think that's what ultimately preserves the political, and again, why the political is not reducible to social movements. I guess that's something that's absent, especially in Russia. But these things are complicated, because if you go back to the early 20th century, you had one of the most incredible experiments in modernity, but here in St. Petersburg with the Russian Revolution, where there was extraordinary intellectual activity. But I think the Soviet Union stamped it out, where there was almost no public sphere. And so it's more difficult for movements to be formed. There's still opposition, but it's much more fragmented. So that would be my short answer, the importance of a discursive public sphere.
Right. Thank you. I have more questions, but I'll wait for the next lecture. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, if they're really, really urgent, but if not, for sure we can stay in touch and also. Yes, thank you really, really very much for the lecture and also for those who listened. That you.
Well, thank you for asking me. It was very nice also to meet you. Have committed to do what I can to help Ukrainian academics. It's the least I can do, and I'm happy to provide some more online. I'm normally refusing to online lectures because I don't really find them all that great. They're not a substitute for in-person events, but nonetheless, um, it's not always practical circumstances of a war. I'm happy to provide a few more. Unfortunately, and I apologize for first saying yes, but I can't, because the thing in August, it's the holiday month, and there's a family holiday planned for beginning of August. I thought I could shift it, but it's not possible. And I am happy to do more of these lectures. I can do 2 or 3 more if there's an interest in it, but entirely for you. I'm interested in the topic, and if it's useful, I will just look over my notes tomorrow and I'll send it to Maria. You can just forward it to anyone. There's some bibliography, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you, and good luck with whatever you're doing. And it would be nice to meet in person when the war is over.
Let's stick to online, and